The asphalt of 7th Avenue did not crack from a bomb or a superpowered fist. It cracked because the air itself suddenly weighed heavier than lead. At exactly 2:14 p.m., every window in the Vought International Tower vibrated with a frequency that human ears could not hear, but human bodies recognized as the presence of death. It was a crushing heaviness that forced pedestrians to their knees, gasping for oxygen that was still there but felt too thick to inhale. This was not a weather event. This was the atmosphere of the planet rejecting a foreign object. Inside the conference room on the 99th floor, the Homelander stopped mid-sentence. His heart rate, usually a flat line of absolute boredom and control, spiked for the first time in years. He looked out the reinforced glass, not with his laser vision nor his X-ray sight, but with a sudden primal confusion that he had never experienced since the laboratory. He felt small. The sky above Manhattan was not tearing open like a science fiction portal. It was bruising, a shade of black and crimson that did not belong in the color spectrum of this reality began to leak into the clouds, staining the daylight like ink dropped into clear water. Birds fell from the sky, their hearts stopped by the sheer density of the pressure radiating from the cloud layer. This was not the physics of Compound 5. This was not a biological mutation or a military experiment gone wrong. This was the sudden intrusion of a spiritual mass so dense that gravity bent around it in agony. Cars stalled as their electrical systems fried under the static discharge of a foreign energy source. In the subway tunnels beneath the city, the rats froze, overwhelmed by a sudden flood of instinctual terror that had no scent and no source. The sensors in the Vought Crime Analytics Center went red, then black, unable to measure a power output that had no thermal signature and no radioactive decay. The technicians stared at their screens, watching the graph lines plummet as their equipment simply gave up on trying to understand what was happening. Then the sky broke. It sounded like a mountain snapping in half, a noise so loud it shattered the remaining windows for 10 blocks. A vertical fissure ripped through the atmosphere, jagged and wrong, revealing a void of swirling currents that looked like churning mud and gnashing teeth. From that wound in the world, a single figure fell. He did not fly with a cape. He did not glide on technology. He fell like a stone dropped from heaven, trailing black ribbons of energy that dissolved at the concrete edges of the buildings they brushed against. The figure crashed into the center of Times Square, but there was no explosion of fire. There was only a shockwave of dust and a silence that felt heavy enough to crush a tank. The impact threw cars onto their sides and flattened the street lamps, yet the center of the crater was silent. The dust cloud was thick, swirling with black and red sparks that hissed when they touched the ground. Inside the crater, a young man in tattered black robes stood up slowly. He held a blade that looked like a giant butcher knife made of night. He looked up at the massive digital billboards showing the smiling corporate faces of the Seven, and he did not recognize the gods of this world. He wiped blood from his forehead, his orange hair bright against the grey ruin of the street. He looked confused, tired, and incredibly dangerous. The pressure intensified, rolling out from him in waves. High above in his tower, Homelander felt a trickle of warm blood run from his own nose. He touched it, looked at his red finger, and his eyes widened. For the first time in history, the world was afraid of something that wasn't him. The air tasted like iron and old rain. The laws of physics were trying to heal the hole in the sky, but the man in the black robe was keeping it open just by breathing. The dust in Times Square did not settle. It hung, suspended in the air, caught in the updraft of the invisible power radiating from the crater. Ichigo Kurosaki stood at the center of the devastation, his breathing ragged but controlled. He gripped the hilt of Zangetsu, the rough wrapping biting into his palm, grounding him in a reality that felt fundamentally incorrect. The spiritual particles in the air, the reishi, were thin, stagnant, and tasted of industrial decay. This was not the Soul Society. It was not Huecomundo. It looked like the world of the living, like Karakura town amplified 1,000 times and stripped of its soul. But the spiritual resonance was silent. There were no hollows screeching in the distance, no plus souls wandering the wreckage waiting for a conso. There was only a suffocating void and the terrified heartbeats of thousands of humans pressing in on his senses like a physical weight. He closed his eyes for a second, expanding his senses, reaching out for a familiar signature. Rukia, Renji, anyone. He found nothing but a vast grey ocean of muted souls, flickering dimly like dying candles. Ichigo stepped out of the crater. The asphalt crunched loudly under his sandals. The silence of the city was unnatural. Usually, a crash this size would be filled with screams, sirens, the chaotic noise of panic. But the pressure he was emitting, the sheer density of his spiritual pressure, was acting as a suppressant. Civilians within a 3-block radius were pressed flat against the pavement, conscious but unable to move, their motor functions overridden by the instinctual terror of being in the presence of a predator that the evolutionary chain had not prepared them for. A few brave souls tried to crawl, dragging themselves into storefronts, noses bleeding from the pressure change. Ichigo pulled his reiatsu back, wrapping it tight around his skin. The immediate effect was a collective gasp as thousands of people suddenly remembered how to breathe. The oppressive gravity lifted, replaced by immediate, chaotic panic. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with frantic speed. Ichigo looked up at the massive screens surrounding the square. They were glitching, distorted by the energy discharge of his arrival, but he could make out the images. Men and women in colorful spandex, smiling, waving, holding products. He frowned. They looked like heroes, like the masked wrestlers his sister Yuzu used to watch, but their eyes in the high-definition photos were vacant and cold. He didn't have time to analyze the local pop culture. He needed to find a way back, or at least figure out why the Dangai had spat him out here. He sheathed the smaller blade of Zangetsu and kept the larger one resting on his shoulder, his posture defensive but not aggressive. He wasn't here to fight. He just needed answers. The first response unit wasn't the police. It was a black tactical van that screeched around the corner of 42nd Street, smashing through a newsstand before skidding to a halt. Heavily armored men poured out, their uniforms bearing the Vought insignia. They didn't shout warnings. They didn't ask for surrender. They raised high-caliber rifles and opened fire. The roar of automatic gunfire echoed off the skyscrapers. Ichigo didn't move. He didn't need to. The bullets hit the invisible barrier of his spirit energy inches from his skin and disintegrated, flattened into useless discs of lead that clattered harmlessly to the ground. The kinetic energy was absorbed instantly. Ichigo looked at the soldiers with a mixture of annoyance and confusion. He had been shot at before, but usually by Quincy arrows or Sero blasts. Lead bullets felt insulting. He vanished. To the soldiers, it looked like teleportation. To Ichigo, it was a simple shumpo, a flash step. He reappeared behind the line of tactical officers, the displacement of air knocking them off their feet. He grabbed the barrel of the nearest rifle with 2 fingers and bent it upwards like wet clay. The soldier holding it stared at him, eyes wide behind his tactical goggles, trembling. Ichigo looked down at the man. He asked where he was. He asked what year it was. The soldier couldn't speak, his mind broken by the sheer proximity to a being whose existence defied the biology of compound fire. Ichigo sighed and let go of the gun. He wasn't getting anywhere. He turned his back on them and walked toward the center of the intersection, his senses alerting him to incoming fast-moving objects. High above, in the Vought tower, the Situation Room was in meltdown. Ashley Barrett was tearing hair out of her head, screaming at a wall of monitors that showed only static. The bio-trackers for the Seven were active, but the target analysis software was returning error codes that didn't exist in the manual. The energy output from Times Square wasn't thermal or nuclear, it was metaphysical, and the computers were trying to interpret it as a weather system. Homelander was already en route, breaking the sound barrier over the Hudson River. Queen Maeve was 2 minutes out. A-Train was on the ground, running interference. The narrative was already being spun. Alien terrorist, supervillain manifested. The cameras on the news helicopters were zooming in, broadcasting Ichigo's orange hair and giant sword to the world. The narrative had to be controlled. If the world saw something the Vought couldn't kill, the stock price would zero out by morning. A-Train arrived first. He was a blur of blue and white, moving faster than the human eye could track. He saw the target, a skinny kid with a big knife, and assumed this would be easy. A standard takedown. Hit him at Mark 1, shatter his femurs, drag him to the containment van. A-Train accelerated, the world blurring around him, the adrenaline of the kill pumping through his veins. He closed the distance in a microsecond, aiming a shoulder check directly at Ichigo's spine. It was a move that had liquefied normal humans and cracked the armor of other supes. Ichigo didn't turn around. He simply stepped to the left. It wasn't a guess. He felt the fluctuation in the air pressure, the intent, the malicious spirit energy spiking behind him. A-Train missed, his momentum carrying him forward uncontrollably. He tripped over his own feet, confused by the sudden absence of the target, and tumbled across the asphalt, crashing into a hot dog stand in a spray of metal and condiments. He scrambled up, wheezing, his heart hammering. He had never missed a stationary target. He looked at Ichigo, who was now facing him. Ichigo's eyes were brown and calm, terrifyingly unimpressed. He asked the speedster why he was in such a hurry. A-Train didn't answer. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. This guy saw him. He actually saw him while he was running. That wasn't possible. Then the sky darkened again, not from a portal, but from a landing. Queen Maeve and Black Noir dropped from the Vought transport hovering above the buildings. They hit the ground with practiced superhero landings, cracking the pavement further. Starlight floated down gently behind them, her eyes glowing, her bare hands charged with electricity. The Deep emerged from a blown fire hydrant, looking wet and irrelevant, but trying to look menacing. The Seven were assembled, minus their leader. The media helicopters circled like vultures. The world was watching. Ichigo looked at the group. He sensed their power. It was strange. It felt biological, mutated, like a chaotic stain on their souls. It wasn't the refined spiritual pressure of a soul reaper or the hollow emptiness of an iron car. It was messy. It felt like a disease that gave strength. He focused on the woman with the tiara. Maeve. She felt the strongest, the most durable, but her spirit was weary, cracked with cynicism. The one in black, Noir, felt empty in a way that reminded him of a doll. The girl with the glowing eyes, Starlight, felt conflicted, her light dim and flickering with fear. Maeve stepped forward, drawing her sword, She shouted for Ichigo to drop the weapon and get on his knees. She went through the script Vought gave them for containment protocols. Ichigo looked at her sword, then at his own massive blade. He rested Zangetsu on his shoulder again. He told her he didn't want to fight. He told her he was lost and just wanted to know where the local Soul Society outpost was. Maeve didn't know what a Soul Society was. She heard society and assumed he was part of some new radical faction. She lunged. Maeve was strong. She could stop a bus with her chest. She swung her sword with enough force to cleave a tank turret. Ichigo blocked it with the flat of his blade without moving his feet. The impact created a shockwave that shattered the glass of the nearest storefronts. Maeve's arms vibrated, the shock traveling up her bones and rattling her teeth. She stared at him, stunned. Her sword hadn't even chipped his. It felt like she had hit a mountain. She gritted her teeth and swung again, faster, harder, abandoning the script. Ichigo parried each blow with lazy precision, the metal ringing like church bells. He wasn't fighting back, he was observing. He was testing the density of this world's strongest warriors. They were heavy, physical, grounded. They lacked spiritual density. They were just meat and bone wrapped in steel. Black Noir saw the opening. He moved in silence, a shadow among shadows, throwing a spread of throwing knives aimed at Ichigo's eyes and throat. Ichigo caught two of them between his fingers and let the others bounce off his skin. He looked at Noir. He told the masked man that he had no killing intent, but his technique was sloppy. Noir paused, tilting his head. This was not going according to the simulation. Starlight unleashed a blast of blinding light, a focused beam of pure energy meant to incapacitate. It hit Ichigo square in the chest. The light engulfed him, blinding the cameras and the onlookers. When the glare faded, Ichigo was still standing there. His shihakusho, his black robes, smoked slightly, but he was unhurt. He brushed the soot off his chest. He looked at Starlight and told her that her light was warm, but it lacked focus. It was just scattered photons. It didn't cut. The seven were faltering. They were used to fear. They were used to opponents who broke under the first sign of overwhelming force. They weren't used to someone who treated their attacks like inclement weather. The panic in the Vought boardroom was reaching critical levels. They needed the nuclear option. They needed the Homelander. And then he arrived. He didn't land. He descended. He floated down from the sky with his arms crossed, his cape fluttering majestically in the wind, a god coming down to scold his unruly children. The cameras focused on him. The music in the editing room probably swelled. Homelander's eyes were glowing red, his smile tight and practiced, hiding a rage that was boiling over. He landed between his team and Ichigo. He looked at his team with disappointment, then turned his gaze to the intruder. He scanned Ichigo with his X-ray vision. He saw bone, muscle, organs. He didn't see the spirit chain. He didn't see the reiatsu vents. He just saw a man, a biological man, and Homelander knew he could break any man. Homelander stepped forward, the crowd cheering faintly in the distance, their programmed adoration kicking in. He spoke with that terrifyingly calm voice, the one that sounded like a father about to punish a child. He asked Ichigo who he was and why he was destroying his city. He called Ichigo a villain. He played to the cameras. He expected Ichigo to cower, to stutter, to beg. Ichigo looked at Homelander. He saw the red, white, and blue cape. He saw the blonde hair and the perfect teeth, and he saw the rot. Ichigo's spiritual senses, honed by battles with literal gods and manifestations of despair, saw through the facade instantly. He saw a soul that was a black, festering wound, a small, terrified child wrapped in absolute power and absolute narcissism. There was no nobility in this man. There was only a void of need. Ichigo felt a wave of pity, which was the one emotion Homelander could not tolerate. Ichigo spoke. He didn't shout. He didn't make a speech. He simply said that Homelander was loud. He said his spirit was screaming. Homelander's smile twitched. The red glow in his eyes intensified. He didn't wait for a witty retort. He fired. 2 beams of concentrated heat vision, hot enough to slice through an aircraft carrier, erupted from his eyes and slammed into Ichigo's face. The air ionized instantly. The concrete behind Ichigo melted into slag. The 7 shielded their eyes. The crowd screamed. It was a kill shot. It was the move that ended every argument Homelander ever had. The smoke swirled around Ichigo's head. Homelander kept the beam on for 5 full seconds, pouring his rage into the heat. He wanted to melt this orange-haired insolence into a puddle. When he finally cut the beam, he expected to see a headless corpse. He saw a hand. Ichigo had raised his left hand, his palm facing outward. The skin was red, smoking, but unbroken. He had caught the laser blast with his bare hand, using a concentration of reiatsu to disperse the heat before it touched his skin. Ichigo lowered his hand. He looked at his palm, blew on it like he had touched a hot stove, and then looked back at Homelander. He asked if that was it. He asked if that was the best the king of this world could do. The silence that followed was heavier than the one that had started the day. Homelander stared. His brain couldn't process the input. Nothing stopped the lasers. Nothing. It was physically impossible. His reality was fracturing. The invincibility that was the cornerstone of his entire psyche was suddenly a variable, not a constant. Ichigo adjusted his grip on Zangetsu. He realized now that these weren't misunderstandings. These people were attacking with lethal intent. He had to stop this before the city was destroyed by their tantrums. He flared his reiatsu, just a fraction. The black and red energy erupted around him like a geyser, visible to the naked eye now. The sky above Times Square turned black as the spiritual pressure displaced the atmosphere. The glass in the skyscrapers shattered, all of it, for 10 blocks. The 7 were forced to their knees, not by reverence, but by the physical weight of Ichigo's spirit crushing their enhanced physiology. Even Homelander buckled, his knees bending, his flight reflex failing against the sheer downward pressure of a being who had defied the Soul King. Ichigo looked down at the struggling heroes. He told them to stop. He told them to listen. He wasn't a villain. He wasn't a hero. He was a substitute Soul Reaper, and he was running out of patience. He looked at Homelander, who was trembling with a mix of exertion and humiliated fury, and gave him a warning. He told him that if he attacked again, he would treat him like a hollow. He would purify him. Homelander looked up, veins bulging in his forehead, his world view collapsing. He didn't hear a warning. He heard a challenge, and for the first time in his life, he felt the icy grip of genuine fear. This wasn't a fight for PR. This wasn't a script. This was a predator from a higher food chain. And the 7 were just prey in fancy costumes. The terrifying sound of Homelander screaming in frustration as he tried to stand up against the weight of a ghost, and failed. The camera feeds cut to black. The world had changed. The age of the super was over. The age of the soul had begun. The silence in the conference room of Vought International was absolute. It was a vacuum more terrifying than the noise of the battle. Stan Edgar sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his hands clasped calmly in front of him. On the massive screen behind him, the frozen frame of the live feed remained paused. It showed the back of a teenager in black robes, and in front of him, the seven on their knees. It showed Homelander, the god of the modern world, looking up with a facial expression that market research had never seen before. It was the expression of a prey animal. The stock market had already halted trading. The internet was a digital riot of conspiracy theories, panic, and memes of the invincible man crumbling under invisible gravity. Inside the room, the seven were absent. They were in medical, or in isolation, or in the case of Homelander, floating in the upper atmosphere staring at the sun, refusing to answer his comms. Ashley Barrett was pacing the length of the room, her phone vibrating constantly with calls from the Pentagon, the White House, and major shareholders. She looked like she was about to vomit. Edgar did not look at her. He looked at the screen. He was not afraid. He was calculating. He saw a variable he could not control, and his mind was already dissecting it, looking for a handle, a lever, a price tag. Miles away, in a basement in Flatiron, Billy Butcher stared at a laptop screen. The room smelled of stale beer, cheap cigarettes, and damp concrete. Frenchie was rewiring a remote detonator at the workbench, his goggles reflecting the blue light of the monitor. Huey was sitting on a milk crate, looking pale, his hands shaking as he held a cup of tea. M.M. was leaning against the wall, his arms crossed, his face a mask of grim focus. On the screen, the footage played on a loop. The arrival, the pressure, the laser stopping. Butcher watched the lasers hit the hand over and over again. He didn't smile. He didn't cheer. He watched with the cold, predatory intensity of a man who had just found a loaded gun in a knife fight. He paused the video on Ichigo's face. He looked at the eyes. He saw the burden there. He saw the same look he saw in the mirror every morning. This wasn't a soup. This was something else. This was a weapon that Vought didn't build. Butcher took a sip of his whiskey and slammed the glass down. He told the boys they were moving. He said the game had changed. They weren't hunting soups anymore. They were hunting the kid. If they got to him before Vought did, they had a chance to burn the whole tower down. Huey asked if the kid was dangerous. Butcher laughed, a harsh barking sound. He pointed at the screen where Homelander was kneeling. He said the kid made the devil kneel. Of course he was dangerous. That was the point. Ichigo Kurosaki did not feel dangerous. He felt sick. The initial adrenaline of the confrontation had faded, replaced by a nausea that permeated his very soul. He sat on the edge of a water tower on a rooftop in Hell's Kitchen. The wind whipped his orange hair across his face, but he didn't feel the cold. He felt the city. In his world, the spiritual atmosphere was a flowing river. Here, it was a swamp. The spiritual particles were heavy, sticky, and polluted. He could feel the emotions of the millions of people below him, but they didn't feel like the distinct spiritual signatures he was used to. They felt muffled, trapped in their own biology. There was no connection to a higher plane. There was no Rishi cycling back to the Soul Society. He had tried to open a Senkaimon, the gate between worlds, moments after fleeing Times Square. He had focused his reiatsu, visualizing the sliding shoji doors, the butterflies, the passage. Nothing happened. The air just vibrated and snapped back. He was locked in. The dangai had sealed behind him. He was trapped in a box made of concrete and cynicism. He needed to understand the rules of this place. He stood up and looked out over the skyline. It looked like the world of the living, but the logos were different. The energy was different. He sensed a presence nearby. It wasn't a living human. It was faint, static-like, a smudge of sorrow against the grey background of the city. He focused on it. A ghost. Finally, something familiar. He flash-stepped, vanishing from the water tower and reappearing in an alleyway 3 blocks down. The transition was rougher here. The friction of the air was higher, dragging against his spirit form. He landed silently on the wet pavement. In the corner of the alley, huddled behind a dumpster, was the spirit of a young woman. She was transparent, grayscale, wearing a torn waitress uniform. She had a chain protruding from the center of her chest, the chain of fate that connected a soul to the world. But the chain wasn't eroding slowly like it did in his world. It was calcified, hard and black, as if the world itself was rejecting her transition. She was crying, but there was no sound. She was stuck in a loop of her final moments, trembling in fear. Ichigo softened his expression. This he could handle. This was the job. He approached her slowly, keeping his reiatsu low and warm, trying to be comforting. He told her not to be afraid. He told her he was a soul reaper and he was going to help her pass on. The spirit looked up. She didn't recognize the title. She just saw a boy with a sword. She flinched. Ichigo knelt down. He explained that he was going to perform a konso. He explained that it wouldn't hurt, that she would go to a better place, a place where she could rest. He believed it. He had done it 1,000 times. He drew the hilt of Zangetsu. He reversed the grip, presenting the butt of the handle. He aimed for the stamp on the center of her forehead, the console symbol. He pressed the hilt gently against her skin. The moment the divine wood touched the spirit, the catastrophe began. In Ichigo's world, the console was a key. It unlocked the pathway to the soul society, purifying the soul and allowing it to enter the cycle of rebirth. But here, there was no soul society. There was no receiver. The signal was sent, but the server didn't exist. The energy that Zangetsu released, pure, concentrated spiritual authority, had nowhere to go. It didn't open a gate. It hit the metaphysical ceiling of the boy's universe and ricocheted back with catastrophic force. The spirit of the woman screamed. It wasn't a human scream. It was a digital screech, a tearing of reality. The chain in her chest didn't break. It exploded. The spiritual matter of her soul, infused with the purification energy that had no outlet, ignited. She didn't pass on. She mutated. The grey transparency of her form turned into a violent, churning black sludge. White bone erupted from her face, forming a mask not of a hollow, but of something worse. A jagged, asymmetrical visor that looked like fused plastic and bone. Her body expanded, tearing through the matter of the dumpster, growing to 10 feet, then 20. The alleyway walls cracked as her spiritual pressure ballooned, corrupted by the incompatibility of the two universes. Ichigo was thrown back by the blast. He skidded across the pavement, digging his blade into the ground to stop himself. He stared in horror. He had tried to save her. He had tried to do the one thing he was supposed to do, and he had turned her into a monster. The creature roared, a sound that shattered every window on the block. It wasn't a hollow. It was a rejection, a cancer made of soul. It swiped a massive, clawed hand through the brick wall of the adjacent building, as if it were smoke, collapsing the structure instantly. Dust and screams filled the air. The creature, the glitch, the anomaly, pulled itself out of the rubble, towering over the street. It was invisible to the normal eye, just like a hollow, but its effects were tangible. Cars swerved and crashed as an invisible force crushed their hoods. Pedestrians were trampled by giant unseen feet. Ichigo stood up. His eyes were wide. He felt the cold realization settle in his gut. He couldn't send them back. There was no back. Every soul he tried to save would become a bomb. He gripped Zangetsu. He had to kill it. He had to destroy the soul he had just promised to save. The guilt was a physical blow, heavier than any attack the Seven had thrown at him. He flash-stepped into the air, raising his blade. He couldn't hold back. He had to erase it before it killed anyone. "Get sugar," he whispered. The black energy swirling around the blade, darker and more unstable than usual, reacting to the poisoned atmosphere. Tensho. The crescent of black energy slammed into the creature. It didn't slice cleanly. It tore. The collision of energies created a shockwave that blew out the facades of the buildings on both sides of the street. The creature shrieked as it was vaporized, its spiritual matter dissolving into nothingness, not purified, just gone, deleted from existence. Ichigo landed in the ruin of the street. The dust was settling again. He looked at his hands. They were shaking. He had just committed murder. In his code, destroying a soul without purification was the ultimate failure. He had just learned that in this world, failure was the only option. But he wasn't the only one watching. High above, a Vought drone, silently hovering on thermal currents, had captured the entire event. It couldn't see the spirit or the creature directly, but its sensors picked up the thermal displacement, the destruction, and the energy readings. The feed went straight to the boardroom where Stan Edgar was still sitting. He watched the building collapse. He watched the invisible impact. He saw the destructive potential, but more importantly, he saw the boy's reaction. He zoomed in on Ichigo's face. He saw the horror, the regret. Edgar paused the frame. He looked at the devastation, and then at the boy who caused it to save. Nothing. Edgar smiled. It was a small, thin smile. He had found the lever. The boy had a conscience. The boy had a moral code. And in the world of Vought, a moral code was a leash. Homelander was not smiling. He was hovering over the Atlantic Ocean, miles from shore. The water beneath him boiled from the heat radiating from his eyes. He was screaming. He was screaming at the clouds, at the sea, at the memory of the orange-haired boy looking at him with pity. He had fired his lasers at the ocean for 20 minutes straight, killing thousands of fish, trying to burn the image of his own weakness out of his mind. It wasn't working. The physics of it didn't make sense. He was the strongest. He was the upgrade. He was the end of history. How could a boy stop him? How could a boy make him kneel? The humiliation was a poison in his blood. He stopped screaming and floated there, panting, his chest heaving. His reflection in the water was distorted by the waves. He looked broken. Then his hearing picked up a sound, a heartbeat, a specific, terrified heartbeat. He focused. He heard Ashley's voice over the comms in his ear, trembling, telling him to come back, that Edgar had a plan. Homelander ripped the earpiece out and crushed it into dust. He didn't want a plan. He wanted blood. He wanted to find the boy and tear him apart with his bare hands. Lasers be damned. He wanted to hear the boy scream. He turned back toward the coast, his eyes glowing with a renewed, unhinged madness. He broke the sound barrier, leaving a sonic boom that flattened the waves. Back in the city, the chaos was spreading. The destruction of the building by the invisible monster had triggered a panic worse than the Times Square incident. People didn't know what was attacking them. They just saw walls exploding. The news was calling it a telekinetic terrorist attack. The National Guard was mobilizing. Tanks were rolling across the George Washington Bridge. The airspace was closed. New York was becoming a fortress. Butcher and the boys arrived in the blast zone in their beat-up van. They wore civilian clothes, blending into the crowd of fleeing onlookers. They saw the rubble. They saw the strange, clean cuts in the asphalt where the Getsuga Tensho had grazed the ground. Frenchie pulled out a handheld device, a modified Geiger counter he had rigged to detect compound V signatures. He waved it over the blast marks. The needle didn't move. He tapped the glass. He switched the sensor array to electromagnetic. The needle spun wildly, then snapped off. Frenchie looked at Butcher and whispered that this energy was impossible. It wasn't radiation. It was barely physics. It was like the air was bleeding. Butcher walked into the center of the street, ignoring the police line tape. He saw Ichigo sitting on a piece of concrete rubble, his head in his hands. The giant sword was gone, vanished into wherever he kept it. The boy looked like a normal teenager now, except for the vibrant hair and the aura of absolute misery. Butcher signaled the others to hang back. He walked up to Ichigo. He didn't pull a gun. He didn't shout. He took a pack of cigarettes out of his pocket, shook one loose, and held it out. Ichigo looked up. His eyes were dull. He looked at the cigarette, then at Butcher. He didn't take it. Butcher shrugged, put the cigarette in his own mouth and lit it. He took a drag and blew the smoke out, watching it drift towards the kid. He spoke in his thick accent. He said it looked like the kid had a rough day. He said it looked like the kid tried to help, and the world kicked him in the teeth for it. Ichigo stared at him. He asked how Butcher knew. Butcher sat down on the rubble next to him, close enough to be dangerous, far enough to show respect. He said he knew the look. He said he knew what it was like to try and do the right thing in a world that was rigged against you. He pointed at the Vought tower in the distance, the V logo shining like a dark star. He told Ichigo that the people in that tower didn't care about right or wrong. They didn't care about souls. They cared about control. And right now, Ichigo was the only thing they couldn't control. Ichigo looked at the tower. He felt the concentration of distorted souls there. He felt the lie. He asked Butcher who he was. Butcher smiled, a genuine, grim smile. He said he was just a bloke who wanted to level the playing field. He said he wanted to offer Ichigo a job, not to be a hero, not to be a villain, but to be a plague, to be the consequence that these gods never thought they'd have to pay. Before Ichigo could answer, the air pressure dropped again. The rubble around them began to vibrate. Ichigo stood up instantly, his hand grasping at empty air, Zangetsu materializing in his grip in a flash of black light. Butcher didn't flinch, though his heart hammered against his ribs at the sudden appearance of the weapon. He looked up. Homelander was descending. But he wasn't doing the messianic float anymore. He was coming down like a meteor. He slammed into the street 50 yards away, the impact cratering the road and sending cars flying. He stood up from the dust, his suit covered in soot, his hair messed, his eyes two pits of molten red. He didn't look at the cameras. There were no cameras here. He didn't look at Butcher. He looked only at Ichigo. He was vibrating with rage. He opened his mouth and let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He said he figured it out. He said Ichigo was a trick, a hologram, a mental projection. He said he was going to rip Ichigo's head off to see if there was a brain inside. Ichigo stepped in front of Butcher. He told the man to run. Butcher didn't run. He stepped back, and hand gripping a hidden crowbar, knowing it was useless, but refusing to be defenseless. Ichigo looked at Homelander. He saw the madness. He saw the instability. He realized that this man wasn't just a bully. He was a walking nuclear bomb with the emotional maturity of a toddler, and he was about to detonate. Homelander launched. He broke the sound barrier from a standing start. He didn't use lasers. He used his fists. He slammed into Ichigo with enough force to shatter a mountain. Ichigo blocked with Zangetsu, but the kinetic force was different this time. Homelander wasn't holding back. He was pouring every ounce of his hysterical strength into the blow. The impact drove Ichigo back, his heels carving deep trenches into the street. They crashed through the front of a bank, through the vault, and out the back wall into the next street. The fight had begun in earnest, and this time there was no surprise factor. Homelander was fighting for his sanity. Ichigo was fighting with the knowledge that his powers were broken, that he couldn't purify, he could only destroy. Every clash of their bodies sent shockwaves that shattered glass for miles. The city began to crumble around them. In the Vought boardroom, Edgar watched the seismic reading spike. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. He didn't call the National Guard. He called the lab. He told the head researcher to prepare the sample they had recovered from the crater in Times Square. The trace amounts of red and black residue Ichigo had left behind. They couldn't control the boy, but they could perhaps inject that energy into someone else, someone expendable, someone who hated Homelander almost as much as Butcher did. Edgar looked at the file on his desk, the file for Soldier Boy. The catastrophe was not just the monster in the alley. It was the realization that the war had started. The containment was broken. The boys had the asset, but Vought had the biology. And the city of New York was the cage where the beasts would tear each other apart. Ichigo parried a blow that would have leveled a skyscraper and realized with a sinking heart that he couldn't protect this world. He was the one breaking it. The impact through the bank vault was not the end of the momentum. It was merely the point of injection. Ichigo Kurosaki and the Homelander tore through the structural integrity of Manhattan like a bullet passing through ballistic gel. They exited the rear of the financial district building, crossed the alley in a blur of red and black, and smashed into the foundation of the adjacent skyscraper. The physics of the collision were grotesque. Concrete did not crumble. It vaporized into fine grey powder under the heat of their friction. Steel girders groaned and snapped with sounds that mimicked artillery fire. Ichigo was on the defensive. His blade held flat against his chest, absorbing the maniacal piston-like blows of a man who had never been denied anything in his life. Homelander was screaming, a continuous, high-pitched shriek of exertion and fury that shattered windows 4 blocks away. He was punching Ichigo into the bedrock of the city, driving him deeper with every strike, his eyes wide and unblinking, burning with a mixture of tears and laser fire. Ichigo felt the weight of the blows. They were heavy. They lacked spiritual pressure, but the physical mass behind them was immense. It was like being hit by a mountain moving at Mach 2. His arms rattled, his bones aching deep inside the marrow. But what disturbed him more was the fragility of the world around him. Every time he blocked, the shockwave killed something. He could feel the small, terrifying flickers of human souls in the building above them snuffing out, not from direct hits, but from the structural collapse, the falling debris, the sheer pressure of the conflict. He was protecting himself, but his presence was an environmental disaster. He gritted his teeth, his eyes narrowing. He couldn't fight here. He couldn't unleash a Getsuga Tensho without leveling Midtown. He was a shark in a goldfish bowl, and the water was running out. He saw an opening. Homelander wound up for a haymaker, his form sloppy, driven by tantrum rather than technique. Ichigo didn't block. He dropped. He utilized utsusemi, a technique of high-speed movement leaving an afterimage. Homelander's fist connected with empty air where Ichigo's head had been a microsecond before. The momentum carried the soup forward, smashing his own face into the granite bedrock they were embedded in. The entire city block jumped 6 inches as the kinetic energy transferred into the ground, seizing the millisecond. Ichigo appeared on the street level above, gasping for air that tasted of pulverized stone and ozone. He needed to leave. He needed to draw this monster away from the population centers. But Homelander was not a hollow. He was not a beast of instinct that would blindly chase bait. He was a narcissist who understood leverage. He erupted from the hole in the street, hovering in the air, his suit torn, his face bleeding, looking like a fallen angel who had crawled back out of hell. He saw Ichigo turn to run. He saw the hesitation. He saw the glance toward the civilians cowering in the subway entrance. Homelander stopped. The red glow in his eyes dimmed, replaced by a cold, cruel clarity. He wiped the blood from his lip and floated higher. He looked at Ichigo. Then he looked at the support columns of the massive 40-story office building next to them. He didn't attack Ichigo. He turned his head and sliced the structural pillars with a casual surgical sweep of his heat vision. The sound of the building dying was a low, mournful groan. Gravity took over. Thousands of tons of steel and glass began to tip. Homelander crossed his arms and smiled. It was the smile of a man who had realized the rules of the game had changed. If he couldn't beat the boy in a fistfight, he would beat him with the boy's own conscience. Ichigo froze. The building was falling toward the crowded intersection. He didn't think. He didn't calculate. The hero reflex, burned into him by years of protecting Karakura town, took over. He shunpoed directly into the path of the collapsing tower. He planted his feet on the asphalt, looked up at the descending wall of death, and flared his reiatsu. He couldn't cut it. Cutting it would just create smaller, deadlier falling rocks. He had to catch it. He thrust his hands upward. The impact was deafening. The pavement beneath his feet exploded, creating a crater 20 feet deep. His muscles screamed as the weight of the entire skyscraper settled onto his palms, held up by a cushion of agonizingly dense spiritual pressure. Blood burst from the capillaries in his shoulders. His vision blurred. He was holding up a city block. Above him, Homelander floated down, drifting close to Ichigo's straining face. The soup hovered just out of reach, watching the struggle with fascination. He taunted Ichigo. He asked him how heavy the morality was. He asked him how long he could hold it before his arm snapped. He reached out and tapped Ichigo's forehead with one finger, a mocking gesture. Ichigo couldn't move. If he moved, thousands died. He was trapped by his own goodness. Then a van screeched around the corner. The side door slid open. William Butcher leaned out, resting a massive, jury-rigged weapon on the doorframe. It looked like a shoulder-mounted cannon made of car parts and stolen stock tech equivalents, buzzing with a chaotic purple energy. Frenchie was screaming from the driver's seat that the capacitor was unstable. Butcher didn't care. He aimed not at Homelander, but at the space between Homelander and Ichigo. He fired. The weapon didn't shoot a projectile. It shot a frequency. A high-pitched, oscillating sonic wave designed to disrupt the inner ear equilibrium of a soup. It was a prototype, untested, meant for A-Train, but it was all they had. The blast hit Homelander. It didn't hurt him, but it disoriented him. His flight stability compromised. He lurched sideways, clutching his ears. His equilibrium shattered for a crucial second. In that second, the distraction was enough. Ichigo roared, pouring every ounce of his remaining spiritual pressure into a repulsive blast. He didn't destroy the building. He pushed it. He shoved the collapsing structure backward against its falling momentum, forcing it to lean back onto its remaining supports. It was a feat of strength that defied physics, a rejection of gravity through sheer will. The building groaned and settled, leaning precariously but no longer falling. Ichigo collapsed to one knee, exhausted. Butcher was already out of the van. He sprinted to Ichigo, grabbed him by the back of his tattered robes, and hauled him up. He didn't offer comfort. He shouted that if Ichigo wanted to live, he had to move now. The frequency weapon would only annoy Homelander for 10 seconds. Ichigo looked at the man, saw the desperate madness in his eyes, and nodded. He was drained. The atmosphere of this world was choking his recovery. He let Butcher drag him into the back of the van. The door slammed shut. Frenchie floored the accelerator, and the van peeled away, disappearing into the smoke and dust just as Homelander shook off the dizziness and fired his lasers into the spot where they had been standing, leaving only a scorched hole in the earth. The inside of the van smelled of copper wire, old fast food, and intense fear. Huey was huddled in the corner, staring at Ichigo as if he were a bomb that had started ticking. Mother's Milk was checking a tactical map, his hands steady but his jaw tight. Kimiko sat opposite Ichigo, watching him with dark, intense eyes, sensing a kindred spirit in the violence he carried. Ichigo leaned his head back against the metal wall of the van, closing his eyes. He tried to meditate, to pull reishi from the air to heal his micro-fractures, but the air was dead. It was like trying to drink sand. He coughed, and blood splattered on the floor mat. Butcher handed him a flask. Ichigo took it, smelled the cheap whiskey, and drank. It burned, but it felt real. Butcher spoke first. He told Ichigo that he was an idiot. He told him that catching a building was the quickest way to get killed in this town. He explained the Vought PR machine. By the time the news cycle hit the evening broadcast, Ichigo wouldn't be the hero who saved the building. He would be the terrorist who knocked it over. Ichigo argued back, his voice raspy. He said he couldn't let people die. Butcher laughed, a dry, humorless sound. He told Ichigo that people died every day because of Vought, and the only difference today was that Vought couldn't monetize the deaths. He leaned in close. He told Ichigo that he wasn't in a comic book. He was in a slaughterhouse, and the only way out was to kill the butcher. Ichigo looked at his hands. He thought about the spirit he had corrupted, the monster he had created. He realized Butcher was right about the rules, even if he was wrong about the morality. This world didn't support salvation. It only supported survival. He asked Butcher what he wanted. Butcher smiled, the predator resurfacing. He said he wanted to know how to kill a god. He wanted to know if Ichigo's sword could cut Homelander's head off. Ichigo hesitated. He knew Zangetsu could cut anything, but he also knew that killing wasn't the answer, or it shouldn't be. But as he looked at the weary, terrified faces of the boys, he felt his resolve shifting. The Soul Society laws didn't apply here. The Gote 13 weren't coming. He was the only authority left. While the van wove through the back alleys of Queens, heading for a safe house in a sub-basement under a bodega, the narrative war began. In the Vought Tower, the machinery of corporate fascism was spinning at maximum velocity. Ashley Barrett stood in the control room, screaming at editors. The footage was being spliced in real time. Angles were chosen that made Ichigo's black robes look sinister, cult-like. The moment where he shoved the building back was edited to look like he was pushing it down. The audio was overlaid with ominous, bass-heavy thrums. The chyron on the bottom of the Vought News network read, "Foreign terrorist assaults New York. Homelander defends freedom." They had pundits already lining up to discuss the Eastern threat, and the need for increased military spending on superheroes. But inside the lab on the 80th floor, a much quieter, deadlier narrative was being written. Stan Edgar stood behind a wall of blast-proof glass. Inside the containment chamber, a team of scientists in hazmat suits were working around a restrained subject. The subject was a low-level super, a regenerator named Gecko, who sold his limbs for fetish money. He was strapped to a table, screaming. In the center of the room, held in a magnetic containment field, was a vial of black and red energy. It was the residue collected from the Times Square crater. It was Ichigo's reiatsu, but separated from his will. It was pure, volatile spiritual power, reacting violently with the oxygen in the room. The head scientist, a man with no morals and a very high salary, explained the theory to Edgar. They believed the energy was a form of exotic radiation that rewrote biological matter. They wanted to see what happened when it interacted with Compound 5. Edgar gave the nod. The injection was administered. The needle went into Gecko's neck. The black liquid entered his bloodstream. The reaction was instantaneous and horrific. Gecko stopped screaming. His eyes rolled back, turning entirely black. The veins in his body darkened, looking like a roadmap of necrosis spreading under his skin. Then, the Compound 5 in his system tried to fight back. The biological mutation clashed with the spiritual pressure. Gecko's body began to twist. Bones snapped and reformed, his jaw unhinged, splitting down the middle. A white substance, calcified and hard, began to erupt from his pores, forming plates of armor. A mask formed over his face, a hollow mask, but twisted by the commercialized, corrupt biology of a soup. He grew larger, his muscles tearing and restitching themselves into dense, grey cords. The creature that had been Gecko broke the straps of the table as if they were wet paper. It sat up and looked at the scientists. It opened its mouth and let out a sound that was not a scream, but a static interference noise that shattered the glass of the observation deck. It fired a blast of energy from its mouth, a Kero, but it wasn't the clean red Cero of a Menos. It was blue, crackling with electricity, fueled by Compound 5. The beam vaporized the three scientists instantly and melted the blast door. Edgar watched calmly, sipping a glass of water, as the automated defense turrets dropped from the ceiling and opened fire. The bullets bounced off the creature's white armor. It was a success. They had created a hybrid, a V-hollow, a weapon that could hunt the boy. Back in the safe house, the atmosphere was grim. The boys were resupplying. Frenchie was trying to analyze the data from the fight, fascinated by the energy readings Ichigo gave off. He described it as the soul of the universe screaming. Kimiko approached Ichigo, offering him a bowl of soup. She didn't speak, but she looked at his sword, then at him, and nodded. She understood the burden of being a weapon. Ichigo ate the soup, feeling the warmth spread through his cold body. He realized he couldn't stay here. He was putting them in danger. He felt the massive spiritual signatures moving in the city. He felt Homelander's rage, a burning beacon in the sky. But he felt something else now, something new, something that felt like him, but wrong, like a reflection in a broken mirror. He stood up. The room went silent. He told Butcher he was leaving. He said there was something else out there now, something Vought made. Butcher argued, slamming his hand on the table. He said they needed a plan. Ichigo shook his head. He said plans didn't work against spiritual pressure, only resolve did. He walked to the stairs. Butcher grabbed his arm. For a moment it looked like a fight would break out. Then Butcher let go. He handed Ichigo a small earpiece. He told him that if he was going to die, to at least let them record it, so they could use the footage to blackmail Vought later. It was the most affectionate thing Butcher was capable of saying. Ichigo took the earpiece. He walked out into the night. The city was under martial law. Drones patrolled the sky. Tanks sat on street corners. Ichigo moved through the shadows, his shihakusho blending with the darkness. He headed toward the new signal, the V Hollow. He found it in Central Park. The military had engaged it and failed. Burning tanks littered the great lawn. The trees were on fire. The creature stood in the center of the destruction, eating the remains of a soldier. It was huge, 15 feet tall, covered in white bone armor with a glowing blue Vought logo burned into its chest. It sensed Ichigo. It turned, roaring the static scream. Ichigo drew Zangetsu. He felt the sickness in the creature. It was a soul tortured into madness, fueled by drugs and science. It was an abomination against the cycle of life. And it was his fault. His energy had made this possible. He stepped forward. The creature charged, moving with the speed of a speedster. It was faster than a normal hollow. It was a blur. Ichigo flash-stepped to meet it. Their blades collided. Zangetsu against the bone claws of the beast. The impact flattened the burning trees around them. But this time, the clash was different. When their energies touched, Ichigo felt a feedback loop. The creature was draining him. It was feeding on his reiatsu to fuel its compound via regeneration. The more power he poured in, the stronger it got. He realized with horror that Vought had engineered a hard counter. They had built a parasite. The creature swiped, its claws tearing through Ichigo's robes and slashing across his chest. Blood sprayed, bright red, human blood. Ichigo stumbled back. He was bleeding. He was tired, and he was fighting a mirror image of his own power that ran on an infinite battery of chemical rage. High above, Homelander watched. He wasn't interfering. He was learning. He watched the creature hurt the boy. He smiled. He saw that the boy could bleed, and if he could bleed, he could die. But Homelander wasn't satisfied with just watching. He wanted to break the boy's spirit. He turned his gaze away from the park, toward the city skyline, toward the hospitals, the schools, the bridges. He activated his comms, speaking to the entire Vought defense network. He gave the order. Designate the target as hostile. All units. Level the grid. Burn it all down to get him. The city lights flickered. The sirens changed pitch. The Vought fleet of automated drones turned their weapons from the creature to the streets. It was the scorched earth protocol. Homelander was holding the city hostage. He was telling Ichigo, "Fight me, or I kill everyone." Ichigo felt the shift. He felt the sudden spike in terror from millions of souls. He blocked another strike from the V Hollow and looked up. He saw the sky lighting up with drone fire. He saw the madness of the decision. He realized then that he couldn't win by playing by their rules. He couldn't be a superhero. He couldn't be a soul reaper. He had to be something else. He had to be the monster they feared. He kicked the V Hollow back, gaining distance. He reached up to his face. His hand hovered over his own mouth. He hadn't used his mask in a long time. He feared it. He feared the hollow within him. But against a world of monsters, only a monster could survive. "If you want a villain," Ichigo whispered, his voice echoing with a dual harmonic, "I'll show you what a real demon looks like." His hand came down. The black and red energy exploded, not as a wave, but as a pillar that pierced the clouds. The pressure in Central Park multiplied by 10. The V Hollow froze, its instincts screaming at it to run. From the pillar of darkness, a white horned mask emerged. Ichigo's eyes turned yellow and black. The hollowification was complete. He didn't look like a hero anymore. He looked like the end of the world. And for the first time since he arrived, The air in the universe bent to his will. He vanished, not a shumpo, sonido. The boom was deafening. He appeared instantly behind the V hollow. He didn't swing his sword. He grabbed the creature's head with one hand and crushed the bone mask into dust. The creature dissolved. Ichigo didn't stop. He looked up at Homelander. He roared, a sound that cracked the camera lenses of the drones filming him. The escalation was over. The war had begun. The King of the Skies was about to meet the King of the Hollows. The terrifying promise of total annihilation. The sound of the sonido was not like the crack of a whip or the boom of a jet. It was the sound of space folding in on itself, a sickening, static-filled tear that nauseated anyone with an inner ear. Central Park was no longer a park. It was a kill box. The Vought automated defense drones, sleek machines of carbon fiber and high-caliber weaponry, were dropping from the sky like swathes of dead insects. They were not being shot. They were being dismantled by a blur of white and black that moved faster than their targeting algorithms could process. Hollow Ichigo moved through the squadron of machines with a brutal, animalistic efficiency. He did not cut them cleanly. He smashed them. He grabbed fuselage sections and crushed them with his bare hands. He kicked rotors into engines. He was a hurricane of condensed spiritual pressure, and the machines were just leaves. The fire from the burning tanks cast long, dancing shadows against the trees, but the darkest shadow was the one wearing the white mask. The soldiers on the perimeter, the ones who hadn't fled, lowered their weapons. They weren't lowering them out of surrender. They were lowering them out of the realization that their bullets were as effective as throwing pebbles at a tsunami. Homelander watched from 2,000 feet up. For the first time in his life, he did not swoop down. He hovered. His cape snapped in the wind, the only sound in his immediate vicinity. His eyes were fixed on the white mask. He felt a sensation in his stomach that he identified as disgust. But deep down, in the lizard part of his brain that Compound Phi had not rewritten, he knew it was terror. He had seen monsters. He had fought mutants, but they were all biological. They all had hearts, lungs, heat signatures. This thing down there felt like a hole in the world. It felt like the absence of life-given form. But Homelander was a narcissist, and narcissism is a fortress that does not fall easily. He convinced himself it was a trick. It was a suit. It was a new Vought experiment he hadn't been told about. Anger replaced the fear. How dare they? How dare they make something that looked stronger than him? He dove. He didn't hold back. He broke the sound barrier instantly, creating a cone of compressed air that shattered every remaining window on Fifth Avenue. He aimed for the white mask. He extended his fists, preparing to turn the creature into red mist. He screamed as he descended, a war cry meant to terrify. Ichigo heard the scream. The hollow inside him heard it and laughed. The mask amplified the sound, twisting it into a dual harmonic growl. Ichigo didn't dodge. He turned and swung Zangetsu upward. The collision was tectonic. Homelander's indestructible fists met the black blade of the Bankai. The resulting shockwave cleared the smoke from Central Park instantly. It flattened the trees for 300 yards in every direction. The ground beneath Ichigo vaporized, turning into a crater of molten glass. But Ichigo didn't move. He stood there, holding the blade with one hand, blocking the full momentum of the world's strongest superhero. Homelander pushed. His veins bulged. His eyes glowed with the intensity of a dying star. He poured every ounce of his strength into the push, expecting the boy's arm to snap, the sword to shatter. Nothing happened. The boy in the mask tilted his head. The yellow eyes stared into Homelander's red ones. Then the boy spoke. The voice was distorted. a mix of Ichigo's human voice and the hollow metallic echo of the monster. He asked if that was all. He asked if the god of this world was just a man in a cape. Ichigo shoved. He didn't use technique. He used brute force. He threw Homelander backward. The soup flew through the air, crashing through the heavy stone walls of Belvedere Castle, reducing the historic structure to rubble. Homelander scrambled up from the debris, his suit torn, his cape hanging in tatters. He was bleeding from his nose and ears. He looked at his hands, shaking with rage. He fired his heat vision. The twin beams of red energy lashed out, melting the stone, burning the air. Ichigo didn't block. He raised his hand. He caught the beams. The energy slammed into his palm, hissing and spitting. The hierro, the iron skin of the Arrancar, protected him. The heat vision, which could slice through airplanes, merely blackened the skin of his glove. Ichigo closed his hand, crushing the energy, extinguishing the light. He pointed his finger at Homelander. A small ball of red energy formed at the tip. It wasn't a Getsuga. It was a Zero. The beam that erupted from Ichigo's finger was not a laser. It was a torrent of concussive force. It hit Homelander in the chest and blasted him out of the park, over the tree line, and into the Upper West Side. Homelander crashed through an apartment complex, smashing through wall after wall, exiting the other side and tumbling into the Hudson River. The silence that followed was heavy. The military had stopped firing. The drones were dead. The fire crackled. Ichigo stood in the crater, his chest heaving. The mask felt hot on his face. The instinct to kill was overwhelming. The hollow wanted to hunt. It wanted to find the man in the cape and eat his heart. Ichigo fought for control. He gripped the hilt of Zangetsu so tight his knuckles cracked. He was winning the fight, but he was losing himself. The atmosphere of this world, so devoid of reishi, so full of despair, was feeding the hollow. It was like breathing pure oxygen into a fire. In the Vought Tower, the panic had turned into a cold, hard strategy. Stan Edgar watched the feed from a high-altitude satellite. He saw the Zero. He saw Homelander, his greatest product, being swatted like a fly. He didn't look worried. He looked intrigued. He turned to Ashley, who was hyperventilating on the floor. He told her to get the PR team on the line. He told her the narrative had changed. Homelander was no longer the invincible god. He was the underdog. He was the man fighting the demon from hell. They would sell sympathy. They would sell fear. If Homelander won, he was the savior. If he died, he was a martyr, and Vought would weaponize his death to secure military contracts for the next 100 years. It was a win-win, as long as the tower didn't fall. Butcher and the boys were watching from a rooftop in Hell's Kitchen. Butcher lowered his binoculars. He looked pale. He had wanted a weapon. He had wanted a soup killer. But this was something else. He watched Ichigo standing in the flames. He saw the horns. He saw the way the boy moved like a glitch in reality. He looked at Huey. He said that maybe they had made a mistake. Maybe they had traded a psychopath for a plague. Huey didn't answer. He was staring at the destruction. He said that Ichigo looked lonely. He said that even with the mask, he looked like he was crying. Homelander erupted from the Hudson River. He was wet, bloody, and humiliated. But he was also adapting. He realized he couldn't win a contest of strength. He had to be smarter. He had to be crueler. He flew up, high above the city, hovering at 30,000 feet. He looked down at the grid of lights. He activated his comms again. He spoke to the city. His voice boomed from every speaker, every phone, every television. He didn't scream. He sounded broken. He sounded scared. He begged the creature to stop. He asked why it was hurting his city. He asked why it hated freedom. He played the victim perfectly. And then he played his ace. He announced that he had planted high-yield explosives at 3 locations in the city: a hospital, a school, a shelter. He lied. There were no bombs. But the city didn't know that. The panic was instantaneous. Millions of people rushed into the streets, screaming, trampling each other. The chaos was absolute. Homelander smiled. He looked down at the park. He challenged Ichigo. He said that if Ichigo was a hero, he would leave. If he stayed, the blood of the city was on his hands. Ichigo heard the broadcast. He heard the panic. The spiritual pressure of millions of terrified souls hit him like a physical wave. It was deafening. The hollow inside him didn't care. The hollow wanted to fly up and cut the man's head off. But Ichigo cared. He felt the weight of the lie. He knew Homelander was bluffing. He could sense the deception in the man's soul, but the people didn't know. If he fought, the panic would kill thousands. If he left, Homelander won, and the tyranny continued. This was the choice, the small choice with the massive outcome. Ichigo looked up at the sky. He could see the tiny speck that was Homelander. He could Shunpo up there in a second. He could end it. He could drive Zangetsu through the man's heart. It would be easy. It would be justice. But he looked at the streets. He saw a mother running with her child. He saw a man shielding his wife. They weren't looking at Homelander. They were looking at him. They were looking at the horned mask, the black sword, the red energy. They were terrified of the savior, not the tyrant. Ichigo realized that in this world, power without context was just terror. He couldn't be their hero. He didn't speak their language. He didn't wear their flag. He was an invader. He made his decision. He would not play the game. He would break the board. He crouched low. The spiritual pressure condensed around him, turning the air black. He didn't aim at Homelander. He aimed at the sky itself. He charged the Getsuga Tensho, but he mixed it with the Seiro. He combined the Shinigami purification with the hollow destruction. The blade hummed with a sound that cracked the asphalt for miles. "Getsuga," he screamed, the voice tearing his throat. "Shero." He swung. The blast was not a beam. It was a column of energy so massive, it engulfed the entire skyline. It shot straight up, missing Homelander by inches. Intentionally. It punched a hole through the clouds, through the atmosphere, and into the void of space. The sky turned purple. The sheer displacement of air knocked Homelander out of the sky, sending him spiraling uncontrollably toward New Jersey. The light was blinding. It was seen from space. It was seen from Europe. But the attack wasn't meant to hit a target. It was meant to send a message, and it was meant to vent. The energy column dissipated, leaving a lingering scar in the atmosphere, a streak of aurora borealis that shouldn't exist. Ichigo stood up. The mask cracked. A fissure ran down the center. Pieces of white bone fell to the ground, dissolving into dust. Ichigo gasped, the air rushing back into his lungs. He fell to his knees. The hollow receded, but the cost was paid. The massive release of spiritual energy, reishi and hollow power mixed, did not just fade away. In the Bleach universe, reishi cycles back to the Soul Society. In the Boys universe, there is no cycle. The energy sat there. It saturated the atmosphere of New York City. It seeped into the concrete. It seeped into the bodies of the dead who had died in the panic. And then, the impossible happened. In a morgue in Queens, a body bag twitched. It wasn't a zombie. It wasn't a soup regenerator. The spirit of the man inside, unable to pass on, and now supercharged by the fallout of Ichigo's Sero, began to transform. The chain of fate on his chest, which had been eroding slowly, snapped instantly. The spiritual matter of his soul exploded outward, reshaping his dead flesh. A white mask formed over his face. A hole opened in his chest. In the subways, where the homeless slept, the sensitive ones began to scream. They saw monsters, not soups, invisible monsters. Small, spider-like creatures crawling on the walls. The negative energy of the city, the cynical, fearful, hateful energy of the boys' universe, suddenly had a form to inhabit. Ichigo had provided the blueprint. He had provided the energy source. Ichigo knelt in the park, his vision blurring. He felt it. He felt the sudden, massive spike in hollow signatures. 1, then 10, then 100. He looked around wildly. The shadows were moving. The air was filled with the shrieks of the damned. He hadn't saved the city. He had infected it. By unleashing the hollow power to stop Homelander, he had bridged the gap between the metaphysics of the two worlds. He had brought the infection of Hueco Mundo to a world that had no antibodies, no soul reapers, and no way to fight ghosts. Butcher arrived at the edge of the crater. He had a gun in his hand, but he lowered it. He looked at the shadows twisting in the trees. He saw a creature, a small lizard-like thing with a white mask, scuttle across a burning tank and vanish. He looked at Ichigo. "What did you do, kid?" Butcher whispered. Ichigo looked up. His face was human again, but his eyes were haunted. I broke the seal. The climax wasn't a victory. It was a paradigm shift. Homelander dragged himself out of a swamp in the Meadowlands, alive, furious, but irrelevant. The narrative was no longer about him. The news helicopters were filming the morgues. They were filming the invisible forces tearing police cars apart. They were filming the sudden epidemic of madness spreading through the population. Vought International went into lockdown. Stan Edgar watched the reports. Spectral phenomena, poltergeist activity, mass hallucinations. He realized that his biological weapons were useless against this. You can't laser a ghost. You can't sue a spirit. He looked at the sample of Ichigo's blood they still had in the lab. He realized they needed a new kind of weapon. They didn't need superheroes anymore. They needed exorcists, and Vought would sell those too. Ichigo stood up. He staggered. He grabbed his sword. He wasn't fighting for his life anymore. He was fighting for his mistake. He had turned New York into a hunting ground. The small choice to spare Homelander and vent his power had resulted in the massive multiversal outcome. The convergence of the realms. The world of the living was now overlapping with the realm of the hollows. Suddenly, a massive tear opened in the sky above the Empire State Building. It wasn't the jagged tear of Ichigo's arrival. It was a garganta, the mouth of Hueco Mundo. It was stable. It was open. And from the darkness, a foot stepped out. It was clad in white armor. Then another. The Espada had noticed the energy spike. They had noticed the new feeding ground. Ichigo looked up at the garganta. He felt the reiatsu. It was familiar. It was Uliora Sifa. The despair was absolute. Ichigo was exhausted, wounded, and branded a terrorist. The local hero was a psychopath who wanted him dead. The government was hunting him. And now, the fourth Espada was descending into a world that couldn't even see him. The scene shifted to Frenchie and Kimiko. They were cornered in an alley by a group of newly formed low-level hollows. The bullets passed through them. Kimiko's claws slashed empty air. The hollows shrieked, preparing to devour their souls. Just as they lunged, a blue arrow of condensed light pierced the skull of the lead hollow. It disintegrated. Frenchie looked up. Standing on the fire escape was not a soup. It was a man in a white suit, adjusting his glasses. Uryu Ishida. The convergence hadn't just brought monsters. It had brought the cavalry. But they were late, and the war was already lost. Ichigo sensed Uryu. He sensed Chad. He sensed Orihime. They had followed his trace. But he didn't feel relief. He felt fear. He knew what Vought would do to them. He knew what Homelander would do to Orihime. Homelander, meanwhile, had returned to the tower. He walked into the boardroom, dripping wet, smelling of swamp water. He didn't say a word. He walked up to the head of the marketing department and crushed it on his skull. He sat at the head of the table. He looked at Edgar. "Fix it," Homelander whispered. "Make me the hero who kills the ghosts, or I burn this building down with you inside it." Edgar nodded slowly. "We are already working on the rebranding, John. You are now the spirit hunter." The world fractured. The genre had shifted from superhero satire to supernatural horror. The boundaries were gone. The masquerade was broken. And in the center of it all, Ichigo Kurosaki realized that he couldn't just beat the bad guy to go home. He had to clean up the mess of an entire universe that was rotting from the inside out. He sheathed Zangetsu. He needed to find his friends. He needed to form a new Gotei 13, right here in the hell of Vaught's America. He turned his back on the burning park and vanished into the shadows, a reaper in a world that had forgotten how to die. The sky above Manhattan did not recover from the scar Ichigo had carved into it. Instead, the wound festered. The purple bruising of the atmosphere deepened into a necrotic black, swirling with a density that defied meteorological explanation. From the stable Garganta hovering above the Empire State Building, the pressure descended like a physical piston. It wasn't just gravity. It was a spiritual command to kneel. Uliora Chife stood on thin air, his hands in his pockets, his white coat motionless despite the wind that whipped debris through the canyons of the city. He looked down at the sprawling metropolis, at the fires burning in Central Park, at the tiny, frantic movements of the biological life forms below. His emerald eyes were empty, reflecting the burning city without a flicker of interest. To him, this wasn't an invasion. It was a disposal. The world felt hollow, devoid of the Soul King's influence, a garbage dump of uncontrolled souls and chaotic biology. He raised a finger. He didn't aim at a specific person. He aimed at the concept of the city itself. A green cerro, small and dense, gathered at his fingertip. On the ground, the panic had evolved into a strange, hysterical rhythm. The populace, unable to see the Arrancar but feeling the crushing weight of his presence, were running blind. Vaught's security forces were firing wildly into the air, their bullets falling back to earth as useless lead rain. Amidst the chaos, a flash of blue light cut through the gloom. Uryu Ishida landed on the roof of a stalled bus, his Quincy bow manifesting as a construct of hard blue reishi. He adjusted his glasses, scanning the sky. He saw Uliora. His breath hitched. Of all the Espada, it had to be the fourth. The difference in scale was immediate. Uryu knew they weren't in Karakura town anymore. If Uliora released Xero Oscuras here, there was no barrier team to contain it. The eastern seaboard would simply cease to exist. Yasutora Sado, Chad, landed heavily beside him, his right arm transformed into the brazo derecha de gigante. He punched the air, creating a shockwave that deflected a falling piece of masonry that would have crushed a family huddled near a newsstand. Chad looked at Uryu. He didn't need to speak. The question was obvious. Where was Ichigo? Uryu tracked the spiritual signature. It was erratic, flickering, dim. Ichigo was alive, but his spirit was turbulent, mixed with the chaotic noise of the city. Before they could move, a black van screeched to a halt next to the bus. The side door flew open. Billy Butcher leaned out, holding an assault rifle that looked like a toy compared to the forces at play. He shouted at the anime boy band to get in. He didn't ask who they were. He saw the glowing bow and the giant arm and categorized them immediately. Assets. Uryu hesitated, his pride chafing at the command. But a second green flash from the sky, a warning shot from Uliora that vaporized the top 10 floors of the Chrysler building, made the decision for him. They jumped in. Inside the van, the tension was thick enough to choke on. Frenchie was driving like a madman, weaving through the gridlock of abandoned cars. Kimiko stared at Chad, fascinated by the arm. Huey looked at Uryu, terrified by the glowing energy. Butcher wasted no time. He demanded to know what the pale thing in the sky was. Uryu explained, his voice clipped and precise. He told them it was an Aranka, an espada, a being of pure emptiness and destruction. He explained that their weapons, their biology, their soups were meaningless against it. Butcher listened, his face hardening. He didn't accept hopelessness. He asked if it could bleed. Uryu said yes, but to make it bleed, you needed spiritual pressure, not gunpowder. Butcher smirked. He pointed to the back of the van, where a stash of stolen Vought experimental rounds lay. He said they would improvise. They found Ichigo in an alleyway in Hell's Kitchen. He was leaning against a dumpster, clutching his sword, his face pale. Orihime Inui was already there. She had arrived separately, guided by her connection to Ichigo, and was currently kneeling beside him, her Soten Kishin barrier rejecting the injuries on his body. The orange glow of her powers illuminated the grime of the alley. When she saw Uryu and Chad, she wept. It wasn't a weep of despair, but of relief. The team was whole, but Ichigo didn't smile. He looked at them with wide, fearful eyes. He told them they shouldn't have come. He told them this world was a trap. It infected everything. Uryu stepped forward. He grabbed Ichigo by the collar of his tattered shihakusho and hauled him up. He told him to stop feeling sorry for himself. He pointed at the sky where the green light was pulsing. He said that if they didn't act, there wouldn't be a world left to be trapped in. At Vought Tower, the boardroom was quiet. Stan Edgar stood by the window, watching the green light reflect off the glass. He was on the phone with the president. He was calm. He explained that the situation was under control. He lied with the smoothness of a tectonic plate shifting. He said that Vought had a contingency. He hung up and looked at Homelander. The leader of the Seven was sitting at the table, staring at his hands. He was vibrating. The humiliation of the fight with Ichigo was still fresh, a raw nerve exposed to the air. But now there was something else in his sky. Another usurper. Homelander stood up. His eyes didn't glow red. They were dark, dull pools of insanity. He whispered that he was done with the monsters. He said he was going to burn the sky until it was blue again. He didn't wait for Edgar's permission. He walked to the balcony and launched himself. The sonic boom shattered the glass of the conference room. Edgar brushed a shard of glass off his suit sleeve. He picked up his secure line and authorized the release of Subject Black. If Homelander failed, Vought would burn the board. The confrontation took place above the Hudson River. Uliora had descended to a lower altitude, hovering 500 feet above the water, observing the human military's futile attempts to target him. He sensed the approach, a biological projectile moving at Mach 3. Uliora didn't turn. He simply shifted his weight. Homelander slammed into the space where Uliora had been, his fist closing on empty air. The soup spun around, hovering, his chest heaving. He screamed at the pale figure. He called him a freak. He demanded to know who he was. Uliora looked at Homelander. He analyzed the being in front of him. He saw the power, the immense physical strength, the energy projection. But he saw no spirit. He saw a man-made object, a doll. Uliora spoke. His voice was quiet, yet it carried over the roar of the wind. He asked Homelander why he shouted. He asked if the volume of his voice was meant to compensate for the silence of his heart. Homelander didn't understand the metaphysics. He only understood the insult. He fired. The heat vision beams, hotter than the surface of the sun, struck Uliora square in the chest. The steam explosion was massive. Homelander kept the pressure on, laughing, pouring his rage into the attack. He burned the air until his own eyes watered. When he finally stopped panting, he expected to see nothing. The smoke cleared. Uliora was standing there. He had one hand raised. He had caught the beams. His hierro was scorched, the white skin blackened, but he was unhurt. He brushed the soot off his chest. He looked at Homelander with mild disappointment. He said that the human's light was hot, but it had no density. It was just temperature. It couldn't cut a soul. Homelander stared. His brain couldn't process it. Ichigo had blocked him. Now this one blocked him. The laws of his reality were dissolving. He flew into a frenzy. He charged, throwing a flurry of punches that could have cracked a continent. Uliora parried them with his hands in his pockets, moving with a fluid, bored grace. He dodged, weaved, and stepped on the air as if it was solid ground. Then he decided the experiment was over. Uliora removed one hand from his pocket. He drove his fist into Homelander's stomach. He didn't use a technique. He just used his raw physical strength reinforced by reiatsu. The impact sounded like a cannon shot. Homelander's eyes bugged out. He felt ribs snap. He felt organs bruise. He was launched backward, skipping across the surface of the Hudson River like a stone, throwing up geysers of water before crashing into the pilings of the George Washington Bridge. The bridge shook. Cars slid into the water. Homelander hung there, embedded in the steel, coughing blood. Real, red human blood. He looked at it, terrified. Meanwhile, on the streets, the battle was joined. The low-level hollows that had been spawned by the energy fallout were swarming. They were invisible to the police, who were firing blindly. But they were visible to the boys now thanks to a crude modification Frenchie had made to their goggles using the lens of a stolen Vought camera and some of the residue Uryu had provided. Butcher aimed his rifle. He wasn't firing lead. He was firing rounds tipped with a synthesized polymer mixed with Uryu's reishi-infused blood, a desperate donation from the Quincy. Butcher fired. The bullet hit a lizard-like hollow. It shrieked and dissolved. Butcher grinned. If it bleeds, you can kill it. If it doesn't bleed, you kill it anyway. Chad and Uryu were a phalanx. Chad held the line, his giant arm blasting hollows back with concussive force, protecting the civilians who were cowering in the subway entrance. Uryu was a sniper, his arrows pinning the monsters to the walls before purifying them. But there were too many. The negative emotions of New York City, the greed, the fear, the cynicism, were a limitless fuel source. For every hollow they killed, 2 more spawned from the dark corners of the city. Uryu realized the tactical impossibility. They were fighting a symptom, not the disease. The disease was the open garganta. Ichigo and Orihime were moving toward the river. Ichigo felt Homelander's reiatsu dip. He felt Ulquiora's cold spike. He knew what was happening. If Uliora killed the king of this world, the balance would shift irreversibly. The vacuum of power would be filled by the hollows. Ichigo looked at Orihime, He told her to stay with Chad. She refused. She said she could reject the damage to the city. She said she could fix the bridge. Ichigo didn't argue. He grabbed her hand and shunpoed. They arrived at the George Washington Bridge just as Uliora was preparing to finish it. The espada was hovering over the broken form of Homelander. He pointed a finger. Aquero Oscuras, the Black Cerro, began to charge. This was it. The attack that would erase the bridge, the river, and half of New Jersey. Homelander looked up, his face a mask of broken pride. He couldn't move. He waited for the end. Getsuga! The shout came from above. Ichigo dropped from the sky, Zangetsu already swinging. He didn't aim at Uliora. He aimed at the Cerro. The black blade crashed into the green energy ball just as it fired. The explosion was contained, but violent. The shockwave blew the water out of the riverbed, exposing the mud and the wreckage of centuries. Ichigo landed in front of Homelander, his back to the Suppi. He held Zangetsu with both hands, panting. His shihakusho was torn, his body bandaged by Orihime's light, but his eyes were fierce. Uliora lowered his hand. He looked at Ichigo. He asked why. He asked why Ichigo would save the trash that had tried to kill him. Ichigo didn't look back at Homelander. He kept his eyes on the espada. He said that this world was messy. He said the people here were angry and lost, but they were alive, and he wouldn't let a ghost from his world dictate who lived and who died here. Uliora closed his eyes. He said that sentiment was a weakness. He opened his eyes. They were different. The slit pupils narrowed. He said he would show Ichigo the difference between a savior and a god. In prison, Murcielago. The release of spiritual pressure was catastrophic. Rain began to fall. It was black rain. The river turned to ink. Ulquiora's form shifted. Huge black wings erupted from his back. His helmet completed itself, forming a horned crown. He didn't look like an Arankar anymore. He looked like a devil. The sheer weight of his reiatsu cracked the suspension cables of the bridge. The steel groaned and snapped. The bridge began to fall. Orihime screamed. She threw her hands out. Santen Keshen. The triangular shield formed, glowing bright orange, catching the falling section of the bridge. It held thousands of tons of steel and concrete, held up by the will of one girl. She gritted her teeth, her feet cracking the asphalt she stood on. Chad and Uryu were there instantly, Chad lending his strength to support the physical weight, Uryu firing arrows to weld the cables back together with reishi bonds. It was a desperate, impossible triage. Homelander watched them. He watched the girl holding the bridge. He watched the boy with the glasses fixing the cables. He watched the giant holding the beam. They were saving the people. They weren't doing it for ratings. There were no cameras here. The news choppers had been grounded by the storm. They were doing it because they had to. It was a concept so alien to him that it made his head spin. He looked at Ichigo, who was standing alone against the bat-winged demon. Homelander felt a strange sensation in his chest. It wasn't goodness. It wasn't heroism. It was envy. He wanted to be the one standing there. He wanted to be the one who mattered. He pulled himself out of the steel. He ignored the pain. He flew up, hovering next to Ichigo. He didn't look at the boy. He looked at Uliora. He said that this was his planet. He said that nobody broke his toys but him. Ichigo glanced at him. He saw the broken ego held together by spite. He nodded. He said they would hit him together. Homelander didn't argue. The team-up was disjointed, messy, and terrifying. Ichigo moved in close, engaging Uliora in a high-speed sword fight. Homelander stayed back. using his heat vision and sonic shouts to harass the espada, creating openings. Uliora was faster, stronger, and more skilled than both of them. He swatted Homelander aside with his wings. He caught Zangetsu with his bare hands, but he was fighting two different physics engines. He had to adjust for Ichigo's spiritual attacks and Homelander's physical force. It slowed him down, just a fraction. Butcher and the boys watched from the riverbank. Frenchie was setting up a device. It was a massive speaker system, rigged to the van's battery and a stolen power transformer. He had found a frequency, the frequency of the Garganta. He believed that if they blasted it with a counter-frequency, they could destabilize the portal. Butcher gave the signal. Frenchie hit the switch. The sound was inaudible to humans, but to the spirits, it was agony. The Garganta in the sky began to vibrate. It wavered. The stable door was destabilizing. Uliora felt it. He looked up. He realized that if the door closed, he would be trapped in this Reishi-poor dimension. He would slowly starve. He looked at Ichigo. He looked at Homelander. He decided that the mission, whatever it was not worth the degradation of his existence. He gathered his energy. He wasn't aiming to kill them anymore. He was aiming to retreat. He unleashed a lance of lightning, Lanza del Relampago. He threw it not at them, but into the river. The explosion was nuclear in scale. A pillar of green fire rose miles into the sky. The water vaporized. The shockwave threw everyone back. Ichigo, Homelander, the boys, the bridge. It was a reset button. When the steam cleared, the sky was empty. The Garganta was gone. Uliora was gone. The heavy, crushing pressure had lifted. The sun was trying to break through the clouds, but it wasn't a clean victory. The city was wrecked. The George Washington Bridge was a twisted skeleton. The Hudson River was boiling, and the world had changed. Ichigo stood on the muddy bank of the river. He was exhausted. His bankai faded, leaving him in his standard shihakusho. He looked at his friends. Orihime was pale, drained from holding the bridge. Chad was nursing his arm. Uryu was cleaning his glasses, his hands shaking. They were alive. Homelander landed a few yards away. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't smiling. He looked at the destruction. He looked at the civilians who were staring at Ichigo with awe. He saw the narrative shifting. He saw that he was no longer the only god in the pantheon. He walked up to Ichigo. The cameras were starting to arrive now. News crews on boats, drones from the shore. The red light returned to Homelander's eyes. He leaned in close to Ichigo. He whispered that Ichigo had saved the city. He whispered that Ichigo had saved him. And then he whispered that he would never forgive him for it. Homelander turned to the cameras. He put on the mask. The smile returned, but it was tighter, sharper. He raised his arms. He shouted that they had driven the demon back. He claimed the victory. He claimed the alliance. He absorbed Ichigo's heroism into his own brand. Butcher watched from the van. He spat out his cigarette. He saw what was happening. Vought was adapting. They would sell the team up. They would sell the spirit war. He looked at Ichigo. The kid looked lost. He didn't know how to play the media game. He just wanted to go home. But there was no way home. The Garganta was closed. The Senkaimon didn't work. The energy Ichigo had released had permanently thinned the veil. Spirits were visible now to anyone with a high enough stress level. The hollows were still out there, hiding in the subways, in the sewers. The world had not gone back to normal. It had moved sideways. Stan Edgar watched the news feed in his office. He was already approving the designs for the new Vought tactical gear. Ghost retardant mesh, spirit bullets, He looked at the file on his desk. It was a dossier on Ichigo Kurosaki. He picked up a pen and wrote a single word across the folder. Acquire. Ichigo looked at the sky. He felt the lingering traces of the hollows. He felt the fear of the city. He looked at Uryu. We're stuck, he said quietly. Uryu nodded. Yes, and we are surrounded. The final shot wasn't a hero pose. It was a wide shot of the ruins of New York. In the foreground, the heroes stood, isolated, alien. In the background, the Vought tower stood tall, gleaming, untouched. And in the shadows of the alleyways, the white masks of the new hollows glowed, watching, waiting. The crossover wasn't an event anymore. It was the new reality, the heavy, sinking realization that the war hadn't ended. It had just become a permanent condition. The commercial played on the massive screens in Times Square, which had been rebuilt with reinforced glass and blessed concrete. It began with a slow-motion shot of a mother tucking her child into bed. The room bathed in a warm, golden light. A soft, reassuring voiceover spoke about safety, about peace of mind, about the things we cannot see but no longer have to fear. The Vought logo appeared, shimmering in a new, spectral silver. The text read, Vought Ethereal Protection. For a monthly subscription, households were guaranteed patrol routes by the new division of sensor-equipped drones, and for the premium tier, rapid response from the Spirit Defense Force. It was a lie, of course. The drones could detect spiritual pressure, but they couldn't stop it. The Defense Force was mostly actors in white tactical gear, waving useless wands. But the subscription numbers were astronomical. Vought stock had not just recovered. It had transcended the physical economy. They had monetized the afterlife. 3 months had passed since the incident at the George Washington Bridge. The city had not returned to normal because normal was an obsolete operating system. New York City was now the thinning point, the scar tissue between the world of the living and the hueco mundo. It wasn't an open invasion anymore. It was a chronic condition. The spiritual density of the city had permanently shifted. People with no latent abilities were starting to see things out of the corner of their eyes. Shadows that moved against the light. Strange, hollow cries echoing in the subway tunnels at 3 a.m. The suicide rate had spiked, and every death fed the atmosphere, creating a feedback loop of despair that spawned more low-level hollows. The government had quarantined 3 boroughs, calling it a biohazard. But everyone knew it was a soul hazard. In the sub-basement of a condemned meatpacking plant in the Bronx, the resistance was eating dinner. The room was a collision of 2 worlds. On one side, Frenchie's workbenches were covered in circuit boards, soldering irons, and stolen Vought compounds. On the other, Uryu Ishida had set up a sterile, precise area for synthesizing spirit particles. The air smelled of ozone, garlic, and old blood. Billy Butcher sat at the head of a rusted metal table, sharpening a knife that Uryu had coated in silver and reishi. He didn't look happy. He looked like a man who had won a battle only to realize the war would last forever. He looked at Ichigo Kurosaki, who was sitting on a crate, staring at the floor. Ichigo had changed. The orange hair was longer, messy. He wore a heavy grey hoodie over his shihakusho to blend in with the street crowds. He looked tired, in a way that sleep couldn't fix. He wasn't just fighting monsters anymore. He was fighting the entropy of a universe that shouldn't exist. Orihime Inoue was trying to teach Kimiko how to fold paper cranes. It was a quiet, surreal moment of innocence in the bunker. Kimiko's movements were sharp, aggressive, tearing the paper. But Orihime was patient, her smile wavering but present. Chad was sleeping in a chair, his massive frame taking up most of the space, his arm twitching in his sleep as if fighting off invisible enemies. They were refugees. The Soul Society hadn't contacted them. No hell butterflies came. They were stranded in a godless tank, and they were the only ones keeping the water clean. Butcher broke the silence. He threw a file onto the table. It slid across and hit Ichigo's foot. It was a printout of a Vought internal memo. It detailed Project Necromancer. Vought wasn't just selling protection. They were trying to weaponize the hollows. They were capturing the smaller ones, the mindless beasts, and trying to graft them onto human subjects using Compound 5 as a binding agent. They wanted supers who could phase through walls, who could eat souls. They wanted to franchise the horror. Ichigo picked up the file. He didn't read it. He just crumpled it in his hand. He asked when they were moving. Butcher grinned, a wolf showing its teeth. He said tonight. They had a location on the lab in Jersey. High above them, in the penthouse of the tower, Homelander stood on the balcony. He wasn't wearing his suit. He was wearing a silk robe, holding a glass of warm milk. He looked out at his city. He hated it. He hated the way the shadows moved. He hated that his heat vision, the ultimate authority, was useless against the things that went bump in the night. He had killed 3 people that week, civilians who had startled him, who he thought were ghosts. Vought had covered it up, blaming it on gas leaks, but the fear was eating him alive. He wasn't the apex predator anymore. He was just meat. He looked at his reflection in the glass. His eyes were red, rimmed with exhaustion. He thought about the boy, the one with the mask. He hated Ichigo more than anything in the universe, but he also needed him. It was a humiliating paradox. Without the boy, the ghosts would eat the city, and there would be nobody left to love Homelander. He took a sip of the milk and crushed the glass in his hand, letting the shards and liquid drip onto the expensive carpet. He whispered to himself that he would find a way. He would find a way to kill the dead. The narrative of the world had shifted from superhero celebrity culture to grim, survivalist folklore. Kids didn't trade trading cards of A-Train anymore. They traded protective charms made of salt and iron. The internet was full of spirit spotter forums. The skepticism of the modern age had evaporated, replaced by a medieval superstition, fueled by 4K video evidence. The churches were full. The mosques were full. The temples were full. Everyone was praying to something, anything to keep the hungry ghosts away. But the prayers bounced off the reishi-dense atmosphere. Ichigo stood up and walked to the exit of the bunker. He adjusted Zangetsu on his back. The blade felt heavier these days. He wasn't fighting for duty or for the Gote 13. He was fighting because he had broken the vase, and he was the only one with the glue. He looked back at his friends, at the boys, at the strange, dysfunctional family that had formed in the ashes of the crossover. They were all broken people. Butcher with his rage, Uryu with his pride, Homelander with his narcissism. But in this twisted timeline, they were the immune system. He stepped out into the rainy night of New York. The rain felt oily. He sensed them immediately. 3 hollows perched on the gargoyles of the cathedral across the street. They were watching him. They knew who he was. The White Demon. The Predator. Ichigo didn't draw his sword. He just released a pulse of spiritual pressure, a controlled warning. The hollows shrieked and scattered, dissolving into the darkness. He pulled his hood up. He wasn't a hero. Heroes were for comic books and Vought marketing campaigns. He was a janitor in a slaughterhouse. He began to walk toward the river, toward the next fight, toward the endless night. The crossover hadn't ended with a bang or a portal home. It had ended with a quiet, terrifying realization that there isn't what if. There is only what is. And what is a world where the gods are frauds, the ghosts are real, and the only thing standing between humanity and the void is a teenager with a big sword and a very bad attitude. The story didn't close. It just faded into the static of a surveillance camera, watching a black coat disappear into the fog.